are bringing you a hearing this afternoon related to the death of actor Gene Hackman. The late actor's estate is trying to prevent the release of records from that investigation into the deaths of Hackman and his wife, Betsy Arakawa.
These records include footage showing the couple's bodies. Now, a court put a temporary restraining order on the release of the records pending today's hearing. All right, let's get you back into court now, where the publicist for Gene Hackman is describing how private the actor and his wife were.
Ms. Brewer, did you know Gene and Betsy Hackman?
I did.
And how long had Hackman and Associates represented Gene and Betsy Hackman for? Excuse me.
Yeah, we've represented Gene since the beginning of his career, so about 60 years.
Can you briefly tell me about the Hackmans? What were they like?
Yeah, they were lovely, kind, wonderful, funny, private. Gene was a little shy and reserved until you got to know him. Betsy was wickedly funny. She had a really, really wonderful sense of humor.
You had said that you worked for Hackman and Associates for 27 years.
Yes.
Did you work with Gene and Betsy for the entire 27 years?
Yes. Yes, 27.
Can you tell me, was privacy important to them?
Yes, very.
Do you know how long the Hackmans resided in Santa Fe for?
They moved there before I started working with them, so I would assume sometime in the 90s.
Do you know why the Hackmans chose to live in Santa Fe?
Yeah, Gene made a movie in Santa Fe and really fell in love with it. He liked that it was remote and private, and he could have his anonymity there. He also, at that point of his life, had started painting, and he enjoyed that he could really experience an artist's life in Santa Fe.
Do you know if the Hackmans chose to live in Santa Fe having anything to do with their desire for privacy?
Yes, I believe so. They didn't like everything that LA had to offer them in terms of awareness. They liked their privacy and they liked their private life in Santa Fe.
Do you have any brief stories that you could tell the court regarding any affirmative steps that Mr. and Ms. Hackman took to protect their privacy?
I do. I remember a couple of years ago, Betsy called. She wanted to let me know that they were buying a piece of land because Gene liked to ride his bike there, and he wanted the privacy of being able to ride his bike without anyone, following him or observing him. But she wanted me to let me know. She wanted to let me know specifically because the property is adjacent to the city dump, and she wanted me to be aware if anyone called asking why Gene Hackman lived at the dump, what it was about. More recently, in I think January or early February of this year, I was talking to a producer from CBS News Sunday morning, and they were asking for Gene to do an interview with them, and he had declined for years. And so they called to let me know that they were going to go to Santa Fe and do a piece on Gene without his participation. They were going to go to find people who knew them and get a sense of who they were and do the story that way. And when I told Gene and Betsy about it, they were horrified, really upset. And so I called the producer back and I asked them, can you please not? They would be really upset by this. And they agreed, and they decided not to do the piece. They didn't want to upset Gene and Betsy.
Thank you. Ms. Bedore, in your opinion, did Mr. Hackman take his name, likeness, and image seriously?
Very.
Did Mr. Hackman ever have a writer put into any contracts that you're aware of that might limit the publicity that he was to perform on a movie?
I'm not sure if it was ever contractual. I don't see those things, but for every movie he did, he only ever agreed to generally 2 hours of press on any movie.
Do you know if Mr. Hackman's movie contracts ever permitted him to retain the rights to his name, likeness, and image?
I believe they did, yes. Like, for instance, if any entity wanted to use a clip of Hoosiers in which Gene appears, he has to approve that first.
And did Gene ever deny the approval of the use of those clips?
Often. Yeah, very often. He generally approved things that were for artistic purposes, museums, art showings, things like that. But commercial usages, news programming, things like that, he would generally decline those.
Through your representation of Mr. Hackman, did you ever have to take affirmative steps to protect Mr. Hackman's name, likeness, and image?
Yeah, in the sense of correcting stories or turning things down, turning interview requests down, asking people to, leave them alone, nicely, no, sorry, that's not going to work, that sort of thing, for sure.
In your opinion, if the autopsy photos or videos or images of his last days or Betsy's last days were released to the media, how would this impact his name, likeness, and image?
It's interesting. It's an interesting question. I think that for anything like that to be out in the public, any entity can use it however they want, in perpetuity, and that's not something he would have never agreed in his life for that to happen. So why would we think he would agree to it in his death?
Can you tell me what steps your firm would generally take to counter negative publicity for a client?
Yeah, it would sort of be an all-hands-on-deck situation, really time-consuming, reaching out to every single media outlet, responding to every reporter, which is time-consuming.
Do you believe that the autopsy photos or videos and images of Mr. and Ms. Hackman's last days have any economic value if leaked to the press?
Objection.
Yes.
All right, overruled.
Can you repeat the question?
I think you answered it, but I will repeat it. Do you believe that the autopsy photos or videos and images of Mr. and Ms. Hackman's last days have any economic value if leaked to the press?
Yes, for sure. People could create movies, podcasts, anything, and they could monetize it.
And in your opinion, do you believe that the release of certain images and videos would negatively impact Mr. and Ms. Hackman's name, image, and likeness?
Yes, I do.
A lot of competing factors here in this case. Tough one for the judge, and we're actually waiting for a decision from the judge. He's expected to rule momentarily on whether to keep the injunction in place, preventing release of footage and autopsy reports. Let's bring back in our guest, still with us, criminal defense attorney Josh Schiffer. And Josh, as I said, there are competing interests here. You have what is arguably a public figure. He sort of retreated from that on a number of levels, and you heard the testimony there. Not something he embraced very often. There's laws that prevent certain images, including dead bodies, from being left out. But also there's the public interest. These are generally, a lot of the stuff they're asking for, public records. You want that transparency from government agencies, et cetera. What do you think about this situation?
Michael, as much as he did step back, he also leaned in and aggressively monitored his name, image, and likeness. The steps that he took could seem something common, but only if you really are someone with a lot of notoriety, where people are not just going to use your name, image, and likeness for positive things, but for pecuniary gain, for maybe negative things. And so it appears Mr. Hackman was very proactive in getting his PR involved. They mentioned writers, and obviously people have heard all about writers. The idea that a major motion picture studio would give the ability to restrict media to a star in perpetuity, that's a pretty big deal. Most production houses, they want those movies everywhere. So Mr. Hackman, through this PR, is really trying to show the court exactly how tightly wound he was when it came to controlling his image, his likeness. I particularly like the anecdote about going and living by the town dump, because that's where he could go ride his bike as an old man. And I get that desire and the inability to control the press after such an amazing career. This is someone who was in movies for way more than my entire life, and he's legendary. So I get it. And I think the judge has a tough decision, but I think she's going to continue the injunction and allow Mr. Hackman's estate to protect the privacy and the value thereof, because remember, this is a property interest, really. Someone is going to inherit and manage a valuable asset, that being the perpetual name, image, and likeness of one of America's most beloved stars. That's a little bit different than me knocking off and someone making memes on the internet.
Yeah, no doubt. And to your point about the writers, it's often said in Hollywood that you're not necessarily paid for your acting in the movie, you're paid for the marketing of it after.
Yeah,
because it is
absolutely.
a drug. You're out there running around and you're doing all these things. So the fact that he was able to get a writer tells you just how serious he was.
Yeah, the likeness is absolutely a big part of the profitability of a star.
Yeah.
So, but you know, I just have to push back a little bit, Josh, because it's so confounding to me to think if a person goes to this extent to protect their privacy, why in the world shouldn't it be private once they've died? Now, if there was a public interest, like for instance, this was a murder, that might be a little bit different, but I just have a hard time figuring out any good reason why the public needs this information and why a permanent injunction shouldn't be issued in this case.
You know, there are those really good competing narratives, and I've got some big civil libertarian in me where I'm like, listen, when you're dead, these are records. These are public records for a reason. And it's tough. It comes down to some local control, whether you are a person of a certain level of notoriety, whether you are less protected because of what you've done in your life to put yourself or to end up in the public eye. There is that competing public interest narrative because people are hungry for news. And this wasn't a death that just, you know, faded off. There were some fairly intense bits of speculation still existing. There are people concerned about what did or did not happen with an unbelievably tragic death. You know, even in its most generous terms, this was a really sad and tragic passing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we're just learning that the judge actually denied any release as it goes to the audio that's involved in this case. Now, the thing I wanted to address, though, was something you mentioned earlier, Josh, and you talked about the value of his name, likeness, and image. And I have to say, in my mind, that value wouldn't be there unless he was a public figure. It is undeniably tied to the idea that he is who he is. And so that has to be factored in, this idea that it's only worth something because of who he was, and therefore the public should have an interest in seeing it.
And you're absolutely right, and it's going to depend on the demeanor of whoever manages that asset, what happens as, you know, time unfolds.
Yeah, this is one. I know all eyes are on it, but at some point, at what point does privacy control? That's what this court has to decide. It's not going to be an easy decision, I don't think.